Okay, I'd like to welcome you all to number 116 of the Circle of Wine Writers Let's Talk series. Today's topic is Let's Talk About Wine Judging, Practice and Purpose. I'd like to extend a welcome to our members, those who are joining for the first time, and also those of you who are non-members of the Circle. The Circle was founded in 1960 in the UK and today has 270 plus members, including wine writers, educators, broadcasters, and other professional communicators. Membership is now global with a 50-50 split between the UK and overseas.
Okay, well,
There's more information about the Circle on the website and also details about how to join online. I was going to now hand over to Meg Maker, our chairman, but unfortunately on the east coast of the States, they're having some terrible weather and she's without power. So it's now up to me.
Well, the volume is right there.
I know, but it's not working.
No, it's not. Okay.
Sorry, I'm just going to have to mute people.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so today's presentation will be led by Charles Metcalfe, who doesn't really need any introduction, and Charles is also a committee member. Our other speakers today are Sue Eames, Darrel Joseph, and Liz Gabay. All of them are experienced tasters around the world. So I'd like to now hand over to Charles, who will begin the introduction, and I hope everything goes well. Over to you, Charles.
Andrea, thank you very much. Welcome to all of you. Nice to know we've got a good audience here. I just thought that possibly the easiest thing to do would be to start out by saying a little bit about the competition that Robert Joseph and I started way back in 1984. There was one other competition in the UK at that time, the International Wine and Spirit Competition, but nothing else really in the UK. So we were sort of second out of the blocks, and it was a rather curious situation that started the IWC, the International Wine Challenge, because Robert and I were editing a magazine called Wine Magazine. Actually, at that stage it was called What Wine? And we found ourselves that we had a couple of pages to fill, and we scratched our heads for a bit, and eventually came up with the idea, I think it was Robert's idea, to have a tasting of the best English wines we could find against famous, well-known wines from other countries. And so we got together the best English wines, and we got some famous wines like, I talked to Robert about this the other day. He said Pierre d'Or White was one of the wines, and Blue Nun was there, and there was a decent Chablis. And the result was that the 5 top scores went to English wines. And a question was asked in the UK House of Parliament as to why this happened. Some of the muting is perhaps less effective than others. But anyway, a question was asked, and eventually the wine trade came back to us and said, look, excuse me, if you have a competition, you're meant to be able to choose at the Olympics, you choose your athletes. We want to be able to put in the wines we want to have judged, not to have a random bunch of well-known wines.
I don't get this.
And so that was how it started. And eventually we started, I think the first year, Robert and I, we are quite good at many things, but organization is not perhaps our strongest suit. So we decided to stick with just white wines the first year. We tasted those. And the next year we were much braver and we went for anything. And we were soon out of our depth from the point of view of organization. But luckily before long, we got an administrator. We based our judging because Meg, who unfortunately can't be with us because of East Coast winds, Meg said it would be nice to know what the normal way of judging is for wine competitions. And the answer to that really is there is no one normal way. There is the OIV model, the Organisation Internationale du Vin, which scores out of 100, and it has a very prescriptive marking sheet detailing the number of points you could give for a certain aspect of the wine that you're tasting. We, Robert and I, when we started the Wine Challenge, we'd done quite a lot of judging in Australia and New Zealand, I think possibly South Africa as well, where they were marking the wines out of 20, and not at all like the OIV model. It was a lot of discussion, and we felt the panel was led by a chair, and we felt this was a pretty good model to follow. And what the IWC has always done and continues to do, it's recently got a new owner, is if it thinks that something could be done better, we change. We're very happy, or we have been very happy, to listen to suggestions from tasters and from members of the trade, and try to adjust something to improve the process that it is at the moment, and that continues. But anyway, so it was a slightly random kind of start to the IWC, which is now I think a very well run and a very serious competition. And I will be fascinated to hear from my colleagues on this panel what their own experiences are of the competitions at which they have judged. So who's going to go first? Sue, do you want to go first? You're waiting for a train, so we don't want to lose you to the train. So you better speak first.
Okay. So I judge all over Europe. I judge at the IWC as well, which is fantastic. And I do love the way that's run. And I learned so much from panel chairs and people over the years. But I judge a lot in Europe, in France, in Germany, and in Switzerland. Some of them are OIV competitions. But in France, you have very different competitions. You either judge totally on your own, because presumably no French people could come to agreement on anything. So you sit separately and 4 of you are in a row. So you've got 4 people in the room judging the same wine, but you don't know who they are. So your sommelier is served and you judge the wines in that way. It's great because you can concentrate really well. I judge at Lyon, Frankfurt, and they've got a London competition where we also have amateurs. We have to have wine lovers in the party. The rules are that there are 5 at a table and you have to have a wine lover at the table. So somebody who isn't a professional. You tend to have a sommelier, somebody like me, an educator, a winemaker, etc. So that's wonderful. You get great discussions. And if you have questions about reduction or Brett or whatever, the winemaker is very, very good on doing that. The negative thing I would slightly say, not at the competitions I judge at, because I've dropped out of them, is that it is used by some wines to get sold in supermarkets. So lesser medals on bottles can be used as being a fantastic thing. Oh, I've got 3 medals from somewhere. And I think you just have to, I'm sure Liz will agree. And you just have to avoid those kind of competitions because it's just all about bumping up the price by €1. Chasselas is fascinating because it's obviously just Chasselas. We have old Chasselas. If not, it's international, but a lot of French wine. And the regional competitions are done with the wines coming straight from the barrel. So, for example, down in Orange, where we judge our own wines, the wines are, you'll have CO2, you'll have a bit of sulfur because they come straight out of the barrel. But all the samples are taken by somebody who makes sure that they're coming from that barrel. So there's no cheating. So just a very different thing. It's great, lovely atmosphere, very fair, I think. People are very, very fair. Nobody is encouraged to give more medals than they need to. It's the same thing. We've talked earlier actually about the visual, where you're told to give top marks for the visual unless there actually is a problem, unless there's clouds or bits in it or something like that. So, I think that's just an OIV question. That's really it from me. Any more questions at the end? That's absolutely fine.
Brilliant. Sue, thank you very much indeed. Why don't we hand over to Darrel? Darrel, let's have a male voice.
Yes. Well, I judge in many different competitions internationally, and because I specialize in Central and Eastern Europe, the Balkans, and the Caucasus countries, I also judge in many competitions in those countries, which is always a lot of fun. Can you hear me?
Yes, just.
Let's see. I've have this on as loud as I can go, I think.
Okay, well, go for it and try not to shout.
No,
we've lost you. You've muted yourself. Accidentally muted. The mute sign has come on.
There you go.
You're on again.
There we go. Okay.
Great.
So on the international basis, okay, so I've judged with Decanter for 16 years. And along with that, I mean, that's on a, the setup is by panel according to region. And then within the countries, like I've judged everywhere: Russia, Georgia, Romania, Croatia, Serbia, on and on. I mean, all of these countries that I focus on, and of course, Austria, where I live. I'm based in Austria. And usually most of them have different ways of allowing the wines to be judged. And as I just was mentioning to you before we came on, today was the first day of the AWC Challenge, Austrian Wine Challenge. They call it AWC here in Klosterneuburg, outside of Vienna. And it's broken up into two sessions, one in the spring, one in the summer. And the method there, it's very unorthodox, but it actually is fun. And believe it or not, we tasted 130 wines today. And there is no format the way you were talking about with OIV. You don't have to go through a whole list of characteristics that you want to judge the wine: visually, nose, taste. You just give a score, and unless you detect a fault, then you write down the fault. But that's it. And funny enough, for some years before, I actually joined. I've been doing it for about 8 or 10 years there. But before that, I heard about it and I thought, that's impossible. I couldn't do such. I mean, that doesn't do justice to the wine. But then I did it. I decided, well, you have to find out how it is. And I tried it. And it was like, well, it's actually kind of fun. This will bring up the topic of, which we all should discuss, of does that do the wine and the winemaker justice? Do you know what I mean? Can a wine be judged accurately that way? For the most part, I can say after doing it for about 8 or 10 years, yes. I think the wines, at least the quality of the wines that we have in that competition, yes, it seems to be relatively fair. I mean, I don't think there've been too many, let's say, misjudgings. But anyway, basically, just so you have an idea, that's where I'm coming from. So all these countries, Georgia as well, Georgia, Russia, all the Eastern countries, and then, of course, up in London. Also Germany, though, I have to say, Germany, I judge in Bundesweine and in the Berlin Wine Trophy, and which are two very lovely competitions with lovely people. And and these are more internationally focused. Interesting, too, is the Berlin Wine Trophy. There tends to be a more commercial, quote unquote, focus. So they are looking more at wines, not all, but they look at a lot of wines that go into, say, shops and supermarkets. Okay, versus, let's say, they do have some specialist wines, of course, very specialist wines, but that competition, for example, would focus more on the commercial side, whereas, say, maybe Bundesweine in Germany has a broader range in terms of you make commercial, non-commercial, if you will, But they're both really nice, both lovely competitions. Berlin Wine Trophy does follow OIV, and they do follow the OIV method.
Good, Darrel. Thank you very much indeed. Liz, I think it's your turn. You've heroically come from the vineyards, possibly because it's unnaturally cold in Provence at the moment.
It is, and yeah, I'm sitting cuddled up, watching the grey skies outside. I think, I mean, my first time I judged, I think, was International Wine Competition. I think 1987, somewhere in a room near Clink Vaults, was it? We had a room covered in black plastic so that we didn't ruin the carpet. I seem to vaguely remember. And lots and lots of discussion. I remember the competitions going on for hours after we had all finished tasting, because there'd be big discussions about all the wine. So my training in judging for competitions is very much that original wine competition that we used to do, which obviously got bigger and bigger and bigger. And I have to say, I love the discussion.
element in a competition. So I did say to Charles I didn't want to be in this discussion, which is why I'm here, because I have very mixed feelings about competitions. I do not like the OIV point system. I feel it sucks the soul out of any wine tasting in any competition. And Neil's original comment, sort of drinking a wine can help decide it, but I do understand the judging point of view. So I think sometimes we need to ask, before we judge the value of any competition, it's worthwhile thinking, why is that competition in existence? So is it so that wines can put a sticker on a bottle and say, this is very good? A competition that does not do publicity about the medal winners is of zero use to a winemaker. So a competition is very much designed as a means of promoting and selling wine. So there is that element. There is also the element that I remember on those very early days in the competition. Don't know, Charles, if you remember, one of the big points of discussion is this wine good, or is it typical of it? Does it show typicity? And it's not always the same response. So quite often in a competition, you can get people start shouting, this is not typical of Chianti, da 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 da. We're going to mark it down, but actually it was quite a nice wine. So do you then mark it up because it's a nice wine? And I don't think competitions have always understood or accepted which way that's going. And that is a very, very important point. I was at a competition in Serbia last year. I think Caroline Gilby does amazing work running some of these competitions because she controls that we are allowed to discuss. And we had a flight of 16% Vranic.
Mm-hmm.
And one person on my table just flipped and said, well, that's outrageous. You can't have a good wine that's 16%. I was able to turn around and say, but for the producer, that is what they are aiming at. They are aiming at making a high alcohol red wine. So we have to take into account that that is what they're doing. And I don't feel competitions, I understand we need to have international judges because we're looking at selling wine on the international market. But I don't feel competitions are always very honest in saying, we are asking international judges to come to evaluate wines. Are they good for the international market? Are we judging? I think a lot of the French competitions where the medals are shown within the French market are very French orientated. And in fact, I was speaking to a producer today saying, we give a half-day training to everyone to make sure they know how to judge. And I'm going, fantastic. That really reassures me that you can do it. To give a blanket 15 points for colour and presentation, that I have doubts about. I judge at a competition in Slovakia where I'm, for one reason or another, I'm the panel chair for the orange and natural skin contact white wines. And I had Simon Wolf on my table, and I said, Simon, what am I looking for exactly? I have no idea. And he says, do you like it? If you like it, give a good score. Well, at which point we just disintegrated into a discussion of whether we liked it. Some people's threshold for volatility or Brett is different to others. And it was an interesting lesson in that how much, I know you're supposed to judge on quality, but it is, as a wine taster, how hard it is to be objective, whether we think we're objective or not. I've tasted next to winemakers who will give, I don't know, whatever it is above gold, super double trophy to a wine, and they've said, but it's so well made. It was as dull as ditch water. It was made beautifully. So it ticked all the boxes. So yes, I'm very cynical about the methodology of judging. Discussed with Meg earlier what I think it's important to think as judges, why do we judge? For me, it is part of my working week. I'm not retired. Competitions that do not pay sufficiently for me to spend a week judging wine that I'm never told exactly what it is, which is often also a problem. I learn nothing, I gain nothing. If I go on a competition where there are visits to vineyards, there are master classes, you learn what it is you have just given a goal to or thrown out, then I think, okay, that's part of my own personal training. So yeah, the three things I would say: why is that competition being held? Is it to sell wine? Why are those people judging? And what are their qualifications are important? And the methodology of judging. So I don't think all competitions are equal, and that is worthwhile thinking about.
Liz, that's great. Thank you so much. A very rounded look at a judging methodology, which, apart from anything else, it is very different. I can remember one competition I judged at, which wines were marked out of 7, and which I've never met anywhere else, which I thought was curious. But 100 point, the OAV system, and the 20 point, which tends to prevail in certainly Australia, New Zealand, South Africa. At least it was when I was last in South Africa. It may have changed. I think are more normal sort of bases. But I think it's interesting because the OIV system, in which every aspect of a wine is given a point, given a mark, sorry, I should say, is interesting. But it's fun to hear Darrel saying that the competition that he has just been judging at, you give a rounded mark. I have to say that's how all the Antipodean competitions seem to work. It's the way that we started the International Wine Challenge, because we modeled it on the Antipodean competitions, where a lot of the judges were winemakers, frankly, and they were very, very tough on things like Brett or other things they considered to be faults, and they would just throw a wine out. Now, in this day of increasing numbers of natural wines, it's difficult to know how to approach that, and good that Darrel was prepared to say, well, you just have to say if you like it. I have to say, I have a daughter who's married to an Australian, as it so happens, who they love, or at least he loves, and she's taken up after him, natural wines. And Catherine and I sometimes find ourselves faced with the wine in our glass that they had poured that we really do not want to drink. So and they love it, we hate it. And that's a nightmare for a competition. Where do you go? Darrel.
It's funny you mention, this is really interesting. I'm also on the jury of Gomeo Austria wine guide. And I was on a panel 2 years ago with a very, very super sommelier and really talented guy. And it's interesting because we had a flight of orange wines, and there was now if those of you who are into orange wines, or quote unquote natural orange wines, amber wines, there are certain characteristics, and we came across one wine that I happened to really like, and he threw it out, and and he would. This was so good. Well, he didn't throw it out. He just rated it a lot lower than I did, and I said why I liked it, and I went through my whole discussion actually, and then he went through his, and he said, and this was really amusing. He said, well, it's the generation. And it actually came because, orange wines, amber wines, this is more of a recent thing, right? It's not been going on that long. And especially in big competitions, it's only been added in recent years. And already he was saying, well, it's the generation, meaning I was liking something it made it sound like decades ago. And I said, listen, I've been drinking these as long as you have, and I basically feel the same way you do. It's just that I happen to really like these aspects of the wine. But I thought that was really interesting to add this whole category of orange wines. And already you had a 30-year-old sommelier saying, well, the generations are different and you're liking something that existed ages and ages ago. And it wasn't true, but it was really amusing. And we had a good laugh about it, actually. But it was a difference of taste, which is ironic, especially with orange wines, because, it's in a, let's say it's in a new phase, or it's in a phase where they've gotten better and better compared to what we were originally getting, say, maybe 10 years ago.
Yeah,
I think it's not just orange wine because I have to say, I often get the table with all the rosé for various reasons. I'm absolutely stunned by how people judge rosé. They all go, we all give 15 points for color and presentation, but people still rave about, oh, how pale it is. And then sort of seem to lose all of their wine training when it comes to rosé. People don't look for the same things as you look in red or white or even orange wine. Anne Wies and I have tasted at a rosé competition, which left me in need of a strong whiskey by the end because I thought, this is not how I imagine it's going to be. But I think I think this comes back to this: should we be trained to be judges? I don't know. Anyone remembers? I think Wines of Australia used to do that test. Can you detect faults? And I think only one person in the entire room actually was able to detect a fault successfully. We were all over the place. Some of us noticed the faults. We had no idea what the fault was. And I think the Australians are particularly good at that, helping you work out some of those things. But how trained we are at judging, I think that's a very interesting point. Not just for, orange wine has highlighted the fact that maybe we don't all know, but however good you are at tasting, judging is something different.
Mm-hmm.
That's an interesting point to make from someone with the initials MW after her name, because I have to assume that someone who has passed that extremely rigorous examination knows an awful lot about wine. Maybe it could be said that some of the candidates who are older than you, Liz, didn't have to know as much as today's successful candidates have to know. But even so, I think it's a very impressive qualification, and I can think of one ex-master of wine who actually handed in his papers, so to speak, because he lost his sense of smell, and for him, he felt that was he could no longer use the initials MW because he couldn't do it any longer, which was sad, but a very honest and upright thing to do. What do people feel about the idea of using the criteria that the OIV use with all these different aspects of a wine given as its own mark? Sue, I can see your hands up. But I can't hear you because you're still muted. Unmute thyself, Sue.
We can't hear you.
You've actually frozen as well. I've got to.
Sorry, I'm on
Okay.
competition stood on the 20 scale.
So I'm really sorry. This is a really bad line. We can hardly hear you.
No.
Let me just
Little
leap in
snatches are
then.
coming through. So I'm going to hand back to Liz, if I may.
Yeah, I think
that's fine, no problem.
Oh, good. No. We heard
Suddenly,
you now.
Sue, we heard you loud and clear when you said there was no problem. So,
Oh, right. Oh, sorry. Yes.
Yeah.
No.
No. I think it's
We've lost her
interesting.
again.
Meg's just mentioned judging texture versus aroma and flavor. And some of the OIV sheets, you have a choice of 5 flavors for each category. Does it have typicity? which of these 5 red fruit do you have? Do you have torrefication? Oh, yeah, sometimes torrefication. And these different categories that you then tick off. And I think the Concours Mondial de Bruxelles now have a system where they do that spider web of depending on what fruit you've ticked. And then the producer gets the spider web back to see what their wine profile is. I don't know, I'm just a big cynic. I kind of feel texture's good. You get one shot. If I taste at home, I'll taste the same wine several times. I'll decant. I'll see how it develops, and none of that happens.
Yeah, it's very difficult and I know because of the time that I've spent judging at the International Wine Challenge that that has a system whereby all the wines tasted on the various panels are then looked at briefly, quickly by a team of 6 co-chairs just to check that there's no sort of obvious boob having been made. And it does happen that if you get a wine which might have been a bit closed earlier on in the day, which then by sitting around and eventually getting to the co-chair's table has opened up and is possibly not as reduced as it was, possibly just it's opened up a bit with a little bit of air through it. You can sometimes reassess a wine very positively, usually upwards, because it just hadn't been in a fit state to be tasted at the beginning.
Absolutely.
Which makes life a bit difficult because you can't be expected to decant all the wines, and if so, for how long? I also find that personally, as a taster, there are some days when I'm not tasting. I just feel I'm not tasting as well as I can do. Do any of you others feel that?
Absolutely.
Yeah, it happens. Yeah.
Setting colds aside, that kind of thing. I mean, they're just our days. And I remember there was a while back in the UK where a lot was made about about whether a day was a root day, a fruit day, a leaf day, or I can't remember what the 4th one was. But anyway, and I remember once going to a tasting at one of the major UK retailers, and the buyer was sitting in the corner of the room looking very glum, and I went up and asked him why he was looking glum. And he said, all the red wines taste horrible. And these are the wines he had chosen. And he said, they don't taste as they should be tasting. And that can happen. And, what does the competition do then? It begs the question as to whether anything is possible. Neil Hugowa has said, any comments on using point scores to determine overall rankings of wines, given that easy graders have a disproportionate influence on the outcome, i.e., I guess people who give everything 15 rather than trying to either mark a wine down or give a really good wine a good mark. I think that is a problem, and I don't know. What do you think about that? It's simple, I think, if perhaps you aren't very confident about your wine tasting. I mean, frankly, you shouldn't be there judging in the competition. But if you're giving everything 15.5, that's not really very useful. Any thoughts on that?
But a competition is not free for a producer. A producer pays to put their wine in. If the results of a competition are not enthusiastic, the following year you're going to get fewer producers submitting wine because they're going to go, oh, well, I never get any results. I don't get good results. And I've heard producers say, you never get good results out of that competition. This competition, you always, there's your 30% cut off of gold and silver. So that competition is good, which is why I said you have to find out why a competition is in existence. If you don't get enough medals, nobody will want to put their wine in. Stephen Spurrier used to say, what more can the wine do? Be positive. You're not supposed to be, if you're too critical, you get, your knuckles wrapped. Be positive.
Yeah. Something from Cyril Tolson. if you judge in very local, regional Hungarian wine competitions, none of the locals spit. Only us coming from Budapest presumably do spit. I have to say, I can think of one occasion, particularly at the IWC, where suddenly, after a morning's tasting, one of the judges suddenly rushed out of the room, clutching his mouth, and had thrown up in the toilets. And the chair then said, "Oh, I didn't think he was spitting." I mean, frankly, not spitting in a wine competition is, I think, crazy. But going back to the very first item in this chat from Emil again, Andrew Jefford, whose writing I respect hugely, he says, no wine is ever fully and satisfactorily assessed until it's passed through the back of the mouth, down the esophagus, and into the digestive system. Well, frankly, if you did that with every wine, you'd be lost. And I suppose there are some wine competitions where only very few wines are judged. You know, I don't know, do you judge in competitions where you've only got, say, 20 wines in the morning and 20 in the afternoon? It's not the way that the competitions I've judged in work.
Well, the OIV, the OIV, they used to have a limit of 45, but it's like, or 50 now. I think there's this 45 or 50 wine limit, but you still have to spit.
40 or 55 a morning
45,
or a day?
A day.
Yeah.
A day. Gosh.
Yeah. 45 to 50. Yeah. And yeah, I mean, you basically have to spit. I mean, I have to confess, okay, when there's something that is really shockingly good, of course I'll I'll have a sip afterward, a second sip, and I'll swallow. Who doesn't? I mean, if you have a great Tokai or a lovely Madeira.
Yeah,
but, yeah, sure. But I mean, it's a professional thing. You have to do that. You have to taste. What I never understood about the OIV system is knocking off the highest. If you have a panel of 5 people, you knock off the highest score and the lowest score, and then you have the average of the 3 scores in the middle. I mean, I sort of never quite understood that, because I mean, to me, it's sort of like we're all judging, so it should be a mixture of all 5, right? People, like a decanter, you do it. Everybody's score is.
I quite agree. No, I think I entirely agree with you. Andrew, you wanted to say something.
Gosh, yes, sorry. I just wanted to speak on behalf of Sue, who says sorry she's lost connection, but she wanted to say that most French competitions are the 20 marking scale and not the clunky OIV. And
Oh, really?
she says Tasse de Vinage, she tastes 16 wines over a 2-hour wonderful discussion. So that's a different.
Yeah, I have to say, I feel, as others have said, that tasting wines without any discussion is a pretty soulless kind of thing. You learn when you discuss, and sometimes you see aspects of a wine that one of your fellow judges has noticed and you haven't. I think it's very sterile just to give a mark and then click to the next button. Although I'm sure, I think the IWC is thinking of moving towards a computerized system where you've got to have some sort of way of discussing, I think, because otherwise it's boring and you don't get as much, the wine doesn't get as fair a chance, I don't. I think what everyone who's ever participated in a competition would feel is that he or she wants the wine to have a chance, the best chance it possibly can. So you try to select the best judges you can, and you then, you give the wine an opportunity to tell its own story. And if it's a boring story, it's a boring story, but, give it a chance.
Absolutely.
So I don't know what Charles and Darrel feel. Some competitions have tried to get a balanced team of a winemaker, as Sue was saying, a winemaker, a writer, a professional, which I can understand. I think that sort of maybe balances out how we're discussing about the wine. But there's also takes into play different nationalities. We all have different tastes. And you could end up with a tasting team of 15 to represent every single possible. And I think, Darrel and I have tasted together on a panel of 4 at Decanter, which seemed that number, 4 judges seems to work quite well on a panel. You don't have too many people and you can discuss, and it's quite balanced. I just wondered if anyone's got any opinions on the best size of team and makeup of team.
Can I partly answer that by saying I think teams of even numbers can be difficult because you can have a split which is difficult to find the answer to. I think it was the great Lord Rothermere who once said that any committee, oh God, I can't remember the line now. Any committee of less than 3. No, I've completely forgotten the line. It's so annoying, but basically it came down that he didn't believe in committees. As far as he was concerned, he was the only person. You needed a committee only of 1 person. But that is obviously not satisfactory. But I do think that having an even number of tasters can lead you into 2 people saying one thing, 2 people saying the other thing, and you get a bit stuck. We've got about 15 minutes left. Are there any questions? Andrea, because I think you've been able to keep an eye on things probably better than we have. Are there any questions that you feel we should be answering?
I think Meg's back on the line.
Yeah.
Meg,
I can take that. I've been
great.
keeping note of those. So the first one is Michelle Shaw asked a question about whether or not you're seeing the price when you're tasting, and Michelle, would you like to just remark on that briefly?
Yeah, good question. Michelle, very good question. I remember we at the International Wine Challenge, we tried for a couple of years giving a sort of price bracket to the wines, and what we found curiously was that if you labeled a wine or a particular bracket of wines as inexpensive, people were really quite wary of giving decent marks. They thought, oh, these are cheap wines, we're not going to mark them very well. And on the other hand, if it was wine in an expensive bracket, the same seemed to apply. People would say, oh, this is not nearly good enough to be that price, and give it a bad mark again. So eventually we decided to do away with these price brackets because it really didn't seem to work for majority English British tasters. But a good question.
Very interesting.
I agree, yeah.
Doesn't it help to know, well, I mean, for quality, I mean, you have to judge the wine. I mean, in my head, I judge the wine according to the quality of the wine, no question. You're looking at the vintage, you're looking at the grape variety, et cetera, et cetera, aging, how the wine was aged. It does kind of help to know, I personally, when I see a price bracket, I get an idea, but at the end of the day, I won't, I tend not to, I don't let that influence me as much as the quality of the wine, the uniqueness of the wine, or you know, that quality, if it's in a bracket.
But some competitions don't tell you grape varieties. They don't tell you origin. They tell you absolutely nothing. They give, what's it, the degrees of sugar. It's usually
Sometimes
sort of degrees of sugar,
alcohol,
and so you have zero idea, and then you don't know whether you're judging, is this typical of a Southern Sardinian Malbec blend? Absolutely no idea. And so price, I agree. Price, I think if it's an expensive wine, quite often people judge too critically or are more generous. But I do like knowing the grape variety and the region so that you can judge typicity if you're going to have typicity.
Absolutely.
I absolutely agree. There was a time when I think at the IWC we gave far fewer details, but eventually we agreed completely that in the interests of judges being able to judge a wine because of where it came from, what it was made from. We gave as much information as possible, and we gave region, sub-region, and only in the case of a wine which probably only had 2 or 3 producers in a particular sub-region, would we sort of limit the information, because it became quite obvious who the winemaker was.
Right.
But I think giving as much information as possible, it helps the judges to be able to judge.
Well, one interesting point, I mean, following on that, is sometimes you will have specific countries, and you'll have judges who actually are not familiar with those countries at all, or those grape varieties, especially talking about Eastern Europe, Central Eastern Europe, Balkan countries, very unusual countries, very limited experience. There's a mixture of very experienced people and not so much experience. And this is one thing that I find a little bit surprising when I see it happen, because it's sort of like I've seen wines really scored very highly or very low, without understanding what the grape really does. Have you seen that too, Liz?
Oh yes,
yeah,
a lot.
Yeah.
And what can you say? I mean, I'm often speechless. But it was interesting. Somebody commented about, is it important to have consensus? And I think the problem is you don't always, when they give the results, they don't tell you that there might be somebody who's disputed the gold medal. It can just get a gold medal. Yeah.
If I may, there are many other questions.
Sorry.
Take a couple more, but I'm glad you addressed that one, because that was definitely on the list. I have just my own question. What kind of compensation can one expect for judging competitions?
Very good question. The International Wine Challenge, the co-chairs get a pretty good rate of pay per day, because they're working very hard indeed. I mean, it's entirely usual for the co-chairs to taste between 200 and 300 wines a day, and you're having to sort of spit. My dear friend Oz Clarke developed this sort of double spitting method because he was so worried about any alcohol getting through at all. So he would spit, and then he would sort of have another rinse around his mouth with his facial muscles, and then spit again to try and keep his brain clear. But I think it's hard work. I mean, we asked at the wine challenge, the International Wine Challenge, we asked our tasters to do about 100 a day, but we were doing 200 to 300. So we gave our panel chairs were paid a reasonable rate, and the senior judges likewise. Anyone who was not at that level was not actually paid at all. And so, it was people. But another thing I'd like to say about the wine challenge, the International Wine Challenge, is that we tried to get one person on each panel who possibly was a bit younger, not as experienced, and that gave that younger person the chance to judge with much more experienced judges and to learn about wine in a way that I think all the people who judged at the International Wine Challenge found useful, apart from anything else, because there was this discussion element. And I think just putting down a mark and then moving on to the next wine, it's much less interesting for all the tasters as well, I think, of possibly not giving the wine a good enough chance.
So can we get down to brass tacks, though? Can we actually talk about actual compensation to see? Because none of us are making any money writing articles for magazines any longer.
A lot of competitions, I mean, I think the trouble is, for me, the ones in the UK do not pay for transport to the UK or accommodation, which even if the remuneration is, $250 a day or something, by the time you've paid for your flights and your hotel and your local transport, there is zero. You're into minus income.
Yeah.
Judges elsewhere tend to pay for your travel and your accommodation and all your dinners and everything. So you're not out of pocket. I would say that for if there are no other benefits, you're looking at about 300, 250 a day for a competition, which, as long as everything else is paid for, you kind of feel you've come away with some pocket money, which is quite nice. But it's not a well-paid job at all. And as various people have said, you need to keep practicing, you need to keep up with your judging experience and your knowledge. You very rarely get enough out of it to be able to write an article after a competition. You can't come away and say, no, right now I'm an expert on some minor grape in a minor region, because you're not. So what do you get from it? You are not learning more. It is not feeding into our general knowledge, and you've spent a week.
And it's tough on your teeth.
It really is.
Oh, yes.
You know, I think we've all experienced that. I'm sure I have. Yeah.
So there was one person, Dina Roche. I don't know if you're still here, if you'd like to come unmute yourself and ask a question, but it's just interested in getting into it. Did Dina leave?
No, I'm here.
Oh, great. Hi.
Hi. Yeah, I was just curious, like, for somebody who's interested in getting into wine judging, how do you go about that? And what are competitions looking for in their judges?
Well, I can answer on behalf of the IWC that the judges at the IWC are they all have to have a minimum standard of the diploma at the WSET level. And that doesn't apply if you are a winemaker or someone who is already a professional within the enology business. And I think the IWC is about to get a bit tougher with its judge selection, because over the years, there have been people turning up who weren't really very good tasters. But I think sort of minimum diploma, WSET diploma level. And
thank you.
Yeah.
I think on the OIV website, where it lists all the competitions, if you go to the OIV calendar and it has all the competitions, I think you can click on the competition or some part of the website and write and say, I'm interested. I've never had a response from doing that, but I think in theory, I would say that I think you also need to be a fairly easygoing judge. I have not been thrown off a competition, but I've never been invited back for being maybe slightly too controversial on my opinions. But I think maybe just contact the OIV and say you're interested, if you're interested in the OIV.
And the same would apply for the International Wine Challenge. By all means, ask the question and say why you think you should be considered as a judge. You won't always, you should get an answer, at least the courtesy of an answer, but you won't necessarily get invited. Yeah, but good question.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Vivian, you had a question about, does it matter where the wine is to be sold? In other words, are you tasting with a market of the wine in mind? Vivian, I don't know if you want to unmute.
No.
Never been told. No.
Right. Okay. Really Sorry. Yeah. Okay. For example, at IWC a few years ago, we were judging Chinese Cabernet Sauvignons, and at that point, the style was actually of a quite a sweet red wine, and that is a style that is appreciated in China, but not necessarily elsewhere for a Cabernet Sauvignon. So, how does one decide where to put one's score? How do you judge it sensibly? Do you judge it for the market where it's going to be sold, or do you judge it for the market we know in Europe, for example?
That is one of my criticisms of competitions. You do not know. And so you're judging on my international European, I'm sure my, it is not, It is not clarified, and it should be.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah.
It makes it very difficult, I think.
Can I jump in on that, actually, Vivian?
Yeah, please. This is Janet.
So I've been judging at quite a new wine competition, which is purely designed for all Chinese wines. So all the entries are Chinese wine, but the judging panel are international. So we've got Jane Anson, Jamie Good, you know, fairly big wigs, international judges. And the idea was to, actually, several of you touched on interesting points, which is, do you judge for typicity? Do you judge for what is appealing to the local taste? Or do you, because the nature of the judging panel is international, we should judge it against international standards? Or even questions like, it's a new market, so should the judging even guide or send messages to producers to guide them towards a certain style, right? So these are all fairly interesting questions we try to balance on this in this competition. It's only 2 years old, but it's done in a very rigorous way. The whole process is overseen by PwC, you know, to have oversight. So the whole process is transparent and fair and properly run. But to the point of what is the fundamental criteria, and I think overall, over the 2 years, we've got some producer feedback, and actually what they really value is the international perspective of where their wines are, you know, benchmarked against international standard of quality and style. So it's less to do with the local taste necessarily, because even local taste will change. So Chinese consumer 10 years ago who liked sweet Cabernet Sauvignon and overly oaked Cabernet Sauvignon, actually their tastes have been changing as well. So that's probably not a very solid criteria to say, do we judge a wine, give it a high score because it might appeal to a stereotypical Chinese drinker from North China. You know, that's not something it's not a benchmark that
Janet, I think you're absolutely right.
solid.
And
yeah.
what I would say is that there's no point in inviting international judges
Exactly.
if you don't want them to tell you what they think the international viewpoint would be on a particular wine.
Yes. But what it would be useful, and which is done very well at this competition, is to have some expertise and also some master classes, so the international judges learn about the terroir of China, or what Cabernet Sauvignon in Ningxia, you know, with the pepperiness, is it green, is it black, you know, that sort of specific terroir impact on Cabernet Sauvignon, and they do that very well. So we have panels of Chinese judges and international judges, and we have master classes, we have benchmarking sessions where people discuss why this is a goal according to, you know, a winemaker, or according to a wine writer or an educator, you know. So I think it's one that's done fairly well, and especially for a new market as well. So
no, very interesting. Yeah. Fascinating.
You know,
thank you very much.
Thank you. You know, could I add to that? That's an interesting one. Tomorrow I'm giving a lecture at IMC University in Krems that Charles and I both, we are part-time lecturers at. Tomorrow I'm including Georgian wines, and one of the wines is a Kvanskara. And this, as you know, is a very old traditional sweetish style wine. And I remember being in a competition with a mix of local Georgian and international tasters in Georgia. But luckily, I mean, coming from outside, but I had experience because I had spent a lot of time going through Georgian wineries and to the wine regions, and I knew what Kvanskara was. And I remember, now this is very interesting, but I took the perspective. It's actually very simple, really. We tasted several Kvanskaras, and one of them was its quality was absolutely outstanding. Yes, it was sweet, red, a deep red and sweet, and there were some international judges that thought, oh, well, I mean, it's for the Soviet Union, it's da 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 da, but it was really exceptional quality, and it was really, really beautiful. And I judged it, but based on our, we have experience, right? And if it's just when you talk about thinking of who the market is, you also have to think about, where it comes from. And at the end of the day, your experience as a judge or a taster, you come to know, and you can sort of distinguish between the qualities. And then you will get the lousy stuff. You'll get of course, but then you'll get an exceptional one too. And that's key it's important to know that.
So that's a very good point, Darren. And that's why I think if you don't tell people what style of wine you're tasting, if you don't give them the chance to judge the typicity, that's impossible. So competitions that don't tell tasters the style of wine that they're tasting, how can they judge it properly? They can't.
It helps that but within that range, you can, let's say, you also have to recognize quality too. You know what I mean? Even if you say, that's, I mean, it's a given, but you'd be surprised. I use that grape or that wine as an example of between international local people, following up on what she was talking about with Chinese wine.
Yeah,
but anyway, it's a fine line, but yes, but you're right. It helps to know exactly what the wine is, the style is.
Great.
Charles, this has been a really fascinating discussion, and people are having to drop off because we've run over a little bit. Do you have any final words before we hand it to Liz and Andrea to wrap up?
I mean, all I would say is, talking to Chris Ashton, who is the new boss and owner of the International Wine Challenge, I suddenly thought, why, what can be called? So I spoke to him this afternoon before we met, and he said he thinks that there's going to be more wine coming through because of the changes in the wine world that we're seeing. We're going to be seeing more low alcohol wines, no alcohol wines, and I think it will be our duty as wine judges to try to assess these in as fair a way as we can, and not just dismiss them because it looks as though there's going to be a huge market for these styles of wines going forward.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. It's truly fascinating. There are many, many excellent comments and lots of thanks and praise in the chat as well. So thank you all very much for your contributions. And